I don't know why I did this to myself, but I ended up rewatching Shutter Island the other night. And honestly, it left me feeling strange. Not scared or confused, just that quiet heaviness where you lie in the dark and rethink your decisions, including the brilliant choice of watching a psychological thriller at 2 a.m. on a weekday. But this time, something settled differently. It wasn't the twist. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't even DiCaprio doing that man-on-the-edge expression he's perfected since 2010. What stayed with me was a softer realization that sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it crushes you. And when the weight becomes unbearable, the mind does something terrifying and strangely beautiful. It reshapes the story just enough so you can keep moving. And that's exactly why the title lands so perfectly. He knew the truth, and he chose to forget. Because the ending isn't just a cinematic reveal, it's a question aimed straight at your head. What do you do when the truth hurts more than the lie ever could? Watching Andrew walk down those steps, there was something painfully honest about it. Not weakness, just a man who understood the cost of remembering. And for a moment, I hate to admit it, I understood him too. So if the ending stuck to your brain long after the movie ended, you're in the right place. I've been sitting with this film like it owes me emotional rent money. And the story underneath it is far more personal, far more tragic, and far more human than people realize. Alright, let's break this island open. And to make sense of what he chooses at the end, we have to look at what he was running from in the beginning. Here's the thought that wouldn't leave me alone after the rewatch. Andrew didn't simply lose his mind. That description makes it sound casual, like something he misplaced somewhere between Ward C and the lighthouse. What actually happened was heavier and painfully human. He built a version of himself that he could live with. A story where waking up didn't mean confronting the worst memory a parent can carry. His mind wasn't trying to deceive him, it was protecting him in the only way it knew how, the same way you shove things under your bed when guests arrive. The mess doesn't disappear, you just can't face it yet. That's where Teddy Daniels comes in, not as a heroic fantasy or a dramatic lie, but as a safer identity standing between Andrew and the truth he isn't strong enough to hold. And if you watch closely, you can see how fragile that identity is. His trauma is like a cracked window he avoids looking through because one direct glance would make everything fall apart. By the way, if you're into these kinds of pop culture breakdowns, feel free to like the video and subscribe. I drop new ones every week. Now, back to Andrew. This is where the island itself becomes fascinating. People talk about Shutter Island as if the hospital is running a giant scheme to fool him. But the more you look at it, it more feels like Andrew is the one shaping the puzzle. The doctors aren't tricking him, they're guiding him toward the corners of his mind he's been avoiding for years. The guards aren't tense because of secrets, they're tense because Andrew is unpredictable and has already hurt someone during a break from reality. Chuck feels unusual because he isn't a detective. He's Andrew's doctor trying to keep up with the role. Imagine being a therapist and having to solve a fake case beside your patient. That's not a conspiracy, that's emotional gymnastics. Andrew isn't being misled by the island. He's shaping the island to fit the story he needs. Every odd look, every hesitation, every reaction becomes evidence in the world he's creating because the truth buried underneath is too painful to face. Shutter Island wasn't designed to break him. It was designed to contain him safely. But he walked in carrying a wound that never healed, and he rebuilt the world around that wound. The tragedy is that he isn't running from enemies, he's running from himself. And that brings us to the next layer of the story, the part where Andrew becomes his own unreliable narrator. Here's the part that becomes almost darkly comedic. People finish this movie fully convinced the island is running some elite gaslighting program, like the staff spent months rehearsing a Broadway-level conspiracy. But when you rewatch it with context, the behavior of everyone around him suddenly makes perfect sense. The staff don't look suspicious, they look tired. They're not hiding information, they're trying not to trigger a man who built an entire detective persona to avoid acknowledging what happened at that lake. The guards grip rifles because he's unpredictable. Chuck fumbles the gun, the way someone does when they've only ever seen a firearm in movies. Because he isn't a marshal at all. He's a doctor trying to play along. And the staff around him aren't part of some grand conspiracy. They're just genuinely worried about a patient they spent 2 exhausting years trying to pull back into reality.
Andrew's intelligence becomes its own trap. He's smart enough to turn every crack in his fantasy into proof that he's onto something. Every awkward expression becomes part of the case. Every slip becomes a clue. Every hesitation becomes evidence of a cover-up. The truth is simple and brutal. The island doesn't need to fool him. He's doing the entire job on his own. And once you understand that, the symbolism of the island starts speaking a lot louder.
Once you accept that Andrew is the one reshaping reality, the symbolism becomes impossible to ignore. Shutter Island communicates in 2 elements, fire and water. Water represents the truth he can't face. It's the memory he keeps drowning, literally and emotionally. It surrounds the island the way guilt surrounds his mind. Dolores appears drenched because the real memory is leaking into the fantasy world he's built to avoid it. Fire is where he hides. It's warm, dramatic, and conveniently distorted. The woman in the cave, the invented arsonist Andrew Laetus. Every time fire shows up is Andrew drifting deeper into the story he built for himself. Fire in this movie isn't destruction, it's escape. A warm, dramatic substitute for the cold truth he refuses to face. And then there's the disappearing water glass, a quiet moment where the movie tells you that his brain is editing reality in real time. Not the staff, not a government experiment. His mind. Fire whispers the promise of escape. Water forces the truth he has buried. And throughout the film, he moves back and forth between the two, trapped in that internal struggle. And that internal struggle is exactly why so many viewers cling to a certain theory, even though it doesn't really hold up. Now let's talk about the fan favorite theory, the idea that Andrew was actually a real marshal uncovering government experiments, and the hospital manipulated him into believing he was a patient. It's dramatic, entertaining, and exactly the kind of thing that thrives on late-night Reddit threads. And I get the appeal. It gives Andrew the spotlight as the hero. It turns the island into a clear villain. It makes a story simple and stylish. But emotionally, the pieces don't fit. The staff don't act like masterminds hiding secrets. They act like people who've spent years trying to pull a man out of the shadows of his own mind. The theory isn't unbelievable because it's wild. It's unbelievable because it ignores the emotional logic of the film. But theories aside, the real weight of the movie is in the ending and what Andrew chooses to do once he finally sees the truth. This is where everything circles back. After the lighthouse, after the breakdown, after every layer has been peeled away, you think Andrew has finally returned to himself. But the next morning tells the real story. He sits on the steps, looks at Dr. Sheehan, and slips back into Teddy like he's stepping into a familiar shadow. Then he asks the line the entire film has been slowly building toward. Which would be worse, to live as a monster or die as a good man? People argue over that line like it's a puzzle, but the meaning feels painfully clear. He isn't confused, he isn't slipping again, he's choosing. He's a man who finally saw the truth, and he knows he doesn't have the strength to carry it for the rest of his life. Not every morning, not with those memories. He didn't choose madness, he chose mercy. And that's why the ending lingers long after the credits, because hidden beneath the theories and the symbolism and the twists is a simple human truth. Sometimes the lie is the only place you can breathe. We all have our own Shutter Islands. The memories we avoid, the guilt we bury, the truths that show up soaked at the edges of our thoughts. And maybe that's why this story stays with us.